Welcome to today's webinar about laboratory-developed tests. My name is Jonathan Genzen. I serve as Chief Medical Officer at ARUP Laboratories, and I'm also our Senior Director of Government Affairs. In today's webinar, we're going to provide a presentation on the FDA's proposed rule to regulate laboratory-developed tests, a little bit of the history of where the FDA derives its regulatory authority, and then some of the questions we have and that the clinical laboratory community has related to the proposed rule. For example, do they have the authority to regulate laboratory-developed tests? What would be the impact on the clinical lab community, and what would be the cost to the community and to patients as well? As part of this webinar, we're then going to have a question and answer period where I'll be joined by Jonathan Carr, our compliance officer at ARUP Laboratories. With that, let's begin our presentation. ARUP Laboratories is a nonprofit clinical laboratory enterprise of the University of Utah's Department of Pathology. So we're not just a national clinical reference laboratory, but we also run the clinical laboratories at the hospitals and clinics at University of Utah Health. As such, I think we have a unique perspective as an academic medical center, but also on the impact of clinical laboratory regulations on testing throughout the country. On October 3rd of this year, the FDA published a proposed rule to regulate laboratory-developed tests as medical devices. And there were basically three announcements that I saw. There was the public announcement that we see here on the left, and then the actual proposed rule, which we're going to talk about, which is shown here in the middle. It was published in the Federal Register, which is the appropriate mechanism to share proposed rules. And then there was also a regulatory impact analysis, which we see here on the right. It contained much more information than the proposed rule, so I'll be referencing a little bit of data in that too. What is a laboratory-developed test? This is the definition that the FDA has advanced in the past and is part of the proposed rule. They believe that a laboratory-developed test, or an LDT, is an in vitro diagnostic that is intended for clinical use and designed, manufactured, and used within a single laboratory. It's important to emphasize, though, this is just the FDA's position. I don't believe this is actually a legal definition, nor have I seen a definition proposed within the Federal Register. I also italicized the word manufactured here. The FDA believes that clinical laboratories that develop laboratory-developed tests are manufacturers. I would say that's a perspective that is not widely shared within the clinical laboratory community, but it's one that is shared frequently by the FDA. In this proposed rule, there are actually two proposed amendments, which are very small. One of them is actually technical, so we're just going to focus on this one. They are proposing to amend, updating the definition of an in vitro diagnostic product to make it explicit that IVDs are devices under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, including when the manufacturer of the IVD is a laboratory. That's what they are proposing to change. The other 26,000 words of the proposed rule are actually an explanation of why they believe this should occur and the proposed rollout or timeline of when they would like this new rule to be enacted. The FDA is proposing to exercise enforcement over essentially all laboratory-developed tests with this rule. However, they have said that they plan to continue enforcement discretion over manual tests, things that were essentially developed before 1976, HLA testing, which is used in transplant, forensic or law enforcement testing, and testing used in public health laboratories. That term enforcement discretion just means that the FDA believes that they have the right to regulate this testing. They just choose to not regulate it at this time. The proposed rule would be enacted in 5 stages. I've shown the timeline of these stages here. Stage 1 would involve medical device reporting, which would begin 1 year after the rule is finalized. Stage 2 would involve registration of clinical laboratories in the FDA database, and then listing of all laboratory-developed tests with the FDA. There's also labeling and investigational use requirements that would also kick into gear in Stage 2, and this would happen 2 years after the rule is finalized. Now, labeling is actually a pretty broad term. It's not just the label on a package, but it's also the information that's included in that label and that you share with the public. Stage 3 would involve implementation of quality systems requirements that would occur 3 years after the final publication of the rule. They have said that they may reduce the QSR, quality system requirements, in high complexity CLIA laboratory settings, but that's actually not definitive in the proposed rule. It's just a proposal. Stage 4 involves pre-market submission and review of high-risk diagnostics. That would happen at 3.5 years after the rule is finalized. And then Stage 5 involves the submission and pre-market review of low and moderate risk diagnostics. And that would occur at 4 years after the rule is finalized. I think it's pretty apparent to many of us that many more rules and guidance documents would actually be required for clinical laboratories to adhere to this timeline and to adhere to this proposed rule, but so far the FDA hasn't released more specifics. A big question is, what would compliance with these rules actually cost clinical laboratories? And we don't know that for sure yet because we don't know what the future medical device user fee schedule will ultimately look like. But this is what the current medical device user fees are. For these moderate risk 510K submissions, it's about $21,000 per test that needs to be submitted to the FDA or a third-party accrediting agency for review. Pre-market authorization, these are the reviews for high-risk tests, are about $480,000 currently per test. And then there's a term that many of you may not have heard. It's de novo classification. These are essentially medium-risk tests, but that don't have predicate devices that are already approved. And these would be currently $145,000 per test. One thing that's pretty concerning to many of us is that a change in intended use would categorize a test, at least in the current regulatory definition, as a de novo device and as a de novo submission. And that's potentially a problem because some of our test modifications, where you modify an FDA-cleared or approved device to use it on a body fluid, for example, are changes in intended use. So actually some of the simplest LDTs might actually have a much higher fee, at least under the current proposal. For high-risk pre-market authorizations, there's also an annual fee for periodic reporting of about $17,000 per year. And then there's establishment registration fees for manufacturers that are about $7,600 currently. This is all money that clinical laboratories are not currently spending, and I would say most clinical laboratories, certainly hospital and independent labs, particularly small labs, would have an exceedingly difficult time thinking about meeting these current user fee requirements. That's one of the concerns in the clinical laboratory community, is the discordance between these significant fees and the resources that the clinical labs actually have available. Where does the FDA actually derive its authority to regulate tests from? Its authority is derived from a law passed in 1976, the Medical Device Amendments, which amended a prior law, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, to provide for the safety and effectiveness of medical devices. And these terms, safety and effectiveness, that we use a lot when we talk about tests or medical devices, that all comes from this law. This law authorized the FDA to regulate in vitro diagnostic devices specifically, so that's part of the law. It also established the device classes, which are based on risk. They're described as Class 1, the lowest risk, Class 2, moderate risk, and Class 3, which are ultimately the highest risk tests that require pre-market approval rather than just clearance for Class 2 devices. In the Medical Device Amendments, the law actually defines the term device to include in vitro reagents. So these reagents are devices according to federal law. Laboratory-developed tests, however, are not discussed anywhere within the law itself, nor were they discussed in any of the prior congressional hearings, which were, to be honest, focused mostly on physical devices like pacemakers or catheters or other things that are implantable. The other second point here that's important to note is that the law only applies to devices that are distributed through interstate commerce. And so there's two key words here: commercial distribution and interstate commerce. In the proposed rule, the FDA is describing commercial distribution as not being the physical distribution of something across the country or across state lines, but rather anything that is put onto the market. So they're taking a very expansive definition of commercial distribution. Second, they are also describing interstate commerce as essentially meaning any commerce rather than commerce between states. This is another rather expansive definition or interpretation of the term. But these terms are described in law, and they'll probably come up as part of any legal case that could come up after the rule is finalized. For 16 years after the passage of the Medical Device Amendments, The FDA did not claim any authority over laboratory-developed tests, and they actually published in 1992 a draft document that said that they just learned that laboratory-developed tests actually existed and that labs were using them. So I think there's clearly some regulatory ambiguity on whether Congress ever empowered them to regulate laboratory-developed tests and if they actually have that authority. What evolved, therefore, was two pathways for laboratory testing in the United States, clinical lab testing. This is the commercially distributed pathway and then laboratory-developed tests. And I've got a good picture that the FDA has previously used in presentations that I think describes this really well. Under that first commercially distributed test pathway, manufacturers build test kits that are then reviewed and approved by the FDA. They are then physically distributed, again, that physically commercially distributed to hospitals or clinical labs, and they're used for patient care. That's been regulated by the FDA since the medical device amendments. The second pathway describes the laboratory-developed test pathway, where a hospital or clinical laboratory designs a test internally, and then it uses that test under CLIA regulations to offer testing for patient care, but only at that institution. The FDA is currently claiming that they've got enforcement discretion, that they have the right to regulate it. They've chosen not to in the past, but they're choosing to now. Again, I think that's a legally questionable position, but it's something that will probably be reviewed in the very near future. This last pathway, the LDT pathway, has been regulated by the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments of 1988. We've used it for decades. It actually works really well in hospital settings, and it's a regulatory system that clinical laboratories are used to. There's another item as part of that law, the medical device amendments, that's really important. It's called the general rule in the law. And I'll read it because I think it's so important. The FDA shall not impose requirements that are unduly burdensome to a device manufacturer, importer, or distributor, taking into account his cost of complying with such requirements and the need for the protection of public health and the implementation of this act. Let's unpack this statement a little bit and think about what this really means. And again, this is law. This isn't just my opinion. The FDA is doing a balancing act. It is required to protect the public health as part of what it does, but it has to balance that with reasonable costs for the industry to actually comply with those regulations. If you have a very extensive rule that's enforced, but nobody can actually comply with it because it's too expensive, that's against the Medical Device Amendment General Rule, and it actually wouldn't work. And that's part of our concern in the clinical lab community, is that the cost of complying with the proposed rule is so high that it's actually inconsistent with the general rule. I would say there's a few other concerns that we have when you really look through the proposed rule, and we'll describe a lot of these in our own public statement that we're releasing as part of the public comment period. We believe very much that the FDA has dramatically overestimated the purported risk of laboratory-developed tests. It only discusses these as bad things, and it ignores completely the clinical benefits of laboratory-developed tests. By ignoring that, you can't get this balancing act correct. It's also not factoring in the patient impact from the loss of testing if current testing becomes too expensive for clinical laboratories to continue. On the cost of complying side, we believe that the FDA has dramatically overestimated the financial benefits to society within its proposed rule. We've done our own analysis internally. We share it in our public comment. We believe that they've overestimated the financial benefit about 250-fold. It's a dramatic, I think, misrepresentation of societal benefits. We also believe that the FDA is underestimating costs to patients and health systems, and it's underestimated the compliance costs, which we believe are prohibitive for most clinical laboratories to actually comply with the current proposed rule, at least under the current user fees. How are laboratory-developed tests actually used in clinical care? When you pick up a news story or you hear an FDA public statement, they're always describing them as these complex black box tests that nobody can understand, that aren't being reviewed. It's a very different world in the actual clinical laboratory setting. To demonstrate that, we actually did a study of all test orders in the University of Utah Health System in 2021 by clinicians. This is what clinicians ordered, and they ordered over 3 million tests that year. We then broke those tests out by whether they were FDA cleared or approved assays or laboratory developed tests, and we saw something that was very, very different than what you see in the proposed rule or what you read about in newspapers. For example, we found that almost 94% of tests that our clinicians order are FDA cleared and approved already, and only 4% of tests are laboratory-developed tests. When we talk about leveling the playing field as a rationale for why these proposed rules may need to take place, I mean, it's already very unlevel in favor of FDA cleared and approved assays. So I don't personally believe that's a valid justification for moving forward with the proposed rule. What I do think is important is to get that information out here publicly, and that's why we published this information earlier this year. What are these LDTs that clinicians are actually ordering? Again, these are not these black box complex tests that are being run by boutique laboratories. These are relatively conventional standard of care assays that have been used successfully for a very long time, in many cases well over a decade or decades. Things like tacrolimus, which is an immunosuppressant. The mass spectrometry assay just works better than other assays that are FDA cleared or approved. There's quite a few hormone and vitamin tests on this list. We have some tests that use a technology called flow cytometry because we automate it. We think it runs better when it's automated, but that makes it a laboratory-developed test. And we have some rather routine PCR-based tests, particularly for infectious disease testing. So it's not the portrayal that you see often in news reports or public announcements. And we, again, think it's really important to just get this story out there. You can't talk about laboratory-developed tests without somebody bringing up Theranos. And so I think it's worth just bringing this up head on. I know this slide tends to make people angry, but everything on this slide is true, and I think it's worth emphasizing. The FDA cleared a Theranos test through that 510(k) mechanism. It's still listed on the FDA database as approved. I took a screenshot just a couple of weeks ago to demonstrate this. The portrayal that the FDA alone would have stopped Theranos, I think, is not an accurate representation of what was happening at Theranos and what actually stopped that from occurring. Theranos was stopped by Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the CLIA inspection process that was triggered by really high-quality investigative journalism. Granted, they were running FDA-cleared assays off-label with dilutions. They shouldn't do it. They shouldn't validate it. That makes FDA-cleared tests, LDTs. We all get it. But that was stopped by CLIA and CMS and not by the FDA. And I think that needs to be recognized when we talk about the implications of the proposed rule and whether they would or would not have an impact on something like this happening again in the future. There's two Supreme Court cases that I also want to mention very briefly because I think they may be very relevant to whatever happens after the proposed rule is finalized, if it is finalized. First, in 2022, the Supreme Court heard a case and made a ruling on something called the Major Questions Doctrine. This doctrine says that courts presume that Congress does not delegate to the administration, these are agencies like the FDA, issues of major political or economic significance. I think there's a clear demonstration that the proposed rule has a major economic negative significance to the clinical laboratory community. So it's entirely possible that the Major Questions Doctrine could come up if the proposed rule is taken to court. Second, there's another case that's coming in front of the Supreme Court next year, which is a challenge to this concept called Chevron deference. Chevron deference means that courts should defer to an agency's interpretation of a law if that law is ambiguous. At best, the medical device amendments is ambiguous related to laboratory-developed tests. Depending on what the Supreme Court decides, that could have another major impact on what the FDA is proposing to do with the proposed rule. So we are in the public comment period. The FDA has advanced this proposed rule through something called notice and comment rulemaking. They have to notify the public about the proposed rule. They have to give the public time to comment on it. And then they have to provide responses to general categories of comments as part of notice and comment rulemaking. The deadline to submit your public comments is December 4th. I've included the website address for the FDA submission portal in the Federal Register to submit your public comments. It's a long address. If you just Google these three words, Federal Register LDT, again, Federal Register LDT, chances are this is going to be the first hit that comes back on the search results, and it's a place where you can provide your own comment. A few thoughts on submitting your own comments. We encourage you to submit a public comment. I personally do. I mean, that's the whole point of having a public comment period, is for the federal government to hear back from members of the public. Your voice is incredibly important, and you're the experts. If you're working in a clinical lab, or if you're working in the IVD industry, or if you're a regulator, you're the experts in this area. Keep in mind, however, these are public comments. Anybody can read them. And so think about that before you click submit, because your name is going to be tagged to it. Because of that, I'd give some general guidance here. I think it's appropriate to share your personal opinions and experiences with laboratory testing and LDTs, whatever they are, to share your opinion on the impact of the proposed rule to patient care in your setting, and again, to just be professional. This is a formal public process that everybody can see. A few comments are very important here to consider, though. Please do not submit your comment on behalf of your organization unless you have the authority to do that. You want to stay out of trouble with any organizations who may have different opinions about laboratory-developed tests, but personal comments are your personal right as a U.S. citizen. Do not share any proprietary information, test volumes, financial data, or other test details. Again, these are public comments. If it's not something you would want the entire public to see in terms of financials, this is not the place to put it. It's also worth reiterating, don't share any public health information or otherwise sensitive information. Many of us know people whose lives have been saved by laboratory-developed tests. They may be family members. It's not fair putting their name in a public comment. Keep it private, but express things in a general way that at least talks about the importance of tests for those types of clinical conditions. In ARUP's public comment letter, we have submitted a letter that is on behalf of our organization. We've included our comments essentially into 3 buckets. The first, here shown on the left, is the legal bucket. We don't believe that the FDA actually has the statutory authority from Congress to regulate laboratory-developed tests. LDTs are not devices. Labs are not manufacturers. We've already talked about interstate commerce and commercial distribution. There's another interesting comment here about states not being persons as defined by federal law. There's implications of the proposed rule for the FDA having authority, therefore, to regulate states or state-owned entities. We don't believe that they have the legal authority to do that. And we already talked about the Medical Device Amendment General Rule. The second bucket here involves the regulatory impact analysis. We believe that they've used flawed calculations and assumptions as part of those calculations, that they've overestimated financial benefits and underestimated costs of the proposed rule. Lastly, we have a bucket here on the right of general concerns, things related to patient safety, practice of medicine, logistical challenges. It's unlikely they could actually implement the proposed rule as written. That would cause chaos and confusion for a very large segment of the clinical laboratory industry. We believe there's unique issues related to test modifications, academic medical centers, and the concept of grandfathering, which is not incorporated in the current rule. So remember, the public comment period ends December 4th. Just Google these 3 words. Chances are it's going to take you directly to this link that we list right here. We're going to transition now to a question and answer period where we discuss and answer a lot of the questions that have been submitted in advance and now during the presentation. Jonathan, thank you for joining me for the question and answer period. I think we're going to have a really interesting time here. I know we've got a lot of questions that people submitted in advance as well, and I think we should just dive right in.
That sounds great. Thanks for allowing me to participate in this, John. Just a funny thing that came up yesterday is I was looking for some information in preparation for this question and answer session, and I came across a short video from a popular morning talk show, and they actually did a segment about laboratory-developed tests and the FDA proposed rule. And the name of the segment was FDA Works to Strengthen Lab-Developed Tests. And the host, right off the bat, started with, you know those tests that you can do at home and then you ship them off to a lab to get results? They're super convenient, but now FDA is making moves to step up its oversight on them. And I just thought that was kind of funny and indicative of how there's a lot of confusion or misperceptions even about what laboratory-developed tests are and what this FDA proposed rule is really focused on.
I think there's definitely a lot of confusion out there. There's a lot to unpack even within that quote itself, but I think we're going to do that as part of our questions as we go through them.
Great. Well, let's jump in. We did receive a lot of questions from others outside of ARUP. So I really appreciated your presentation about the background of laboratory-developed tests and information about the proposed rule. What are some things that we think FDA really got wrong about the number of problematic laboratory developed tests and information about what LDTs are and the purpose or the service that they provide to our community?
I think that's a really good place to start. There's a lot of information within the proposed rule that advocate for certain aspects of testing within the clinical lab community. The FDA takes a position on the percent of tests that they believe are problematic. We actually talk about that quite a bit in our public comment letter. We think that the number that they're throwing out there, 47%, is a dramatic overestimation. Laboratory developed tests work really well in our setting. They're highly validated, they're highly regulated. And you might ask me, how do we actually know that? Because we validate them, we keep track of those records, but we also perform external proficiency testing. PT or proficiency testing is when specimens are sent to laboratories, and they're sent to laboratories all across the country, and we compare how those tests do. And we have phenomenal performance with our LDT proficiency testing. It's actually just as good as the PT for our FDA cleared and approved assays. So I think the quality of LDTs out there, certainly at ARUP, is very, very strong. But that's not the message that's being conveyed within the FDA's proposed rule and the explanations of that. We talked about this in the presentation a little bit earlier. They talk about the percent of laboratory developed tests that are in use. And they advocate for 50% of all tests are laboratory developed tests. That's just not consistent with what we see with our test order frequency, like I talked about in the presentation. So I think getting those facts out there is really important. I wish we could have gotten them out there earlier, but this public comment period really is a time to kind of set that record straight and to share what we know. And so we've included that in our public comment, and we've also really made a point all along the way to share what we can in the peer-reviewed literature so that our experience is available for other laboratories to see too. I think that's really important. It's something that at ARUP we've taken pride in and really tried to do.
Okay, great. Let's get into the economics and the financials of this as well.
The fun stuff.
Yes. So the FDA proposed rule has information of cost estimates and estimates about the financial benefits if the rule were to become final. Can you talk a little bit about that and how we sort of disagree perhaps with the way FDA came up with those numbers and what they represent?
They use a financial model to calculate proposed societal benefits, and then they also calculate costs as well. And they want to do those because they need to show that the benefits to society are greater than the costs that the proposed rule would have. Some of the assumptions that I previously mentioned about the percent of LDTs in use, the percent of LDTs that are quote unquote problematic, they go into those calculations of societal benefits. And so if those numbers are wrong, then the total number they came up with for their societal benefit is also wrong. And they propose that it's about a $40 billion societal benefit. In our own calculations, we think that's a 250-fold overestimate, which is what we showed. And we go through the math in our public comment letter as well. That's really, really significant because it puts the benefit way smaller than their cost calculations. And I would say that their cost estimates are also underestimates because they don't really factor in what it would really take a laboratory to comply. They use relatively small numbers for hours that it would take to understand an FDA process or hours that it would take to prepare documents. I think to do that work well, it takes a lot longer than what they're estimating. And so that underestimates the cost. And between those two, I think it shows an imbalance in what they've ultimately advanced. But this is the public comment period. This is our time to share that and to make that argument and to do it publicly, and we're happy to do that. I would hope they relook at their numbers and perhaps make a different estimate that more accurately reflects how clinical laboratories would need to engage to actually comply with the proposed rule.
Let's get into some of the fundamental elements of this and how we as a clinical laboratory see LDTs versus how the FDA defines them. So why are LDTs more accurately described, in our opinion, as services, unlike how FDA wants to label them as products or devices?
Yeah, this is a really, really controversial area depending on who you ask, whether an LDT is a device or a product or a service. It comes down to the fact, in part, that LDTs are not physical items. They're not things that are assembled in kits. And like I talked about in the presentation, they're not physically distributed, commercially distributed through interstate commerce. They're not physical items. And so when you apply a device framework that's really built around physical items to something that is really a process and a procedure, I mean, we have protocols that we follow when we operate and conduct our laboratory-developed tests, I believe as services. It's a whole different mechanism. It's a different way of thinking about what a test is and what a laboratory-developed test is in particular. That discordance, that one side saying this is a product and another side saying this really is a service, this is not a physical object that we're talking about, it really is critical to the argument of whether the FDA has the authority to regulate this. I'd add an extra layer onto this too as a physician. I'm board certified in clinical pathology, which is the study of laboratory testing and the study of human disease. There's an interpretive element to this testing as well, and that interpretive element and that medical opinion that goes into development, but also test interpretation and how we operate the test, it's much more complicated than just a product that has to be locked down. And I think that's really important to recognize because there's value to that. There's value to the expert opinion that the laboratory professional, the laboratory scientist, and the physicians who are pathologists bring to that testing. And that's not recognized within the FDA's proposed rule. I think they view the world of testing as you build something, you lock it down, you never change it, that's good. And we would say from a clinical laboratory lens, that's not the reality of how tests actually perform in practice. Sometimes they break and you have to fix them. Sometimes you have to modify an interpretive comment because you have a unique patient population that your hospital laboratory services. Maybe it's pediatric, maybe it's elderly, maybe they have unique needs that aren't reflected in an FDA cleared or approved package insert or instructions. Those are the things that I think the clinical laboratory brings to the table that are not really recognized as part of the proposed rule. And that if you did lock all testing down, you'd lose that. And that has a negative patient impact. And I know that sounds bold and that sounds strong to say it, but that's why we're here. That's why we're submitting a public comment, because I think it's really important for people to know that over-regulation would have consequences, and regulation that you can't financially comply with has those same consequences. And I think the clinical laboratories really bring a lot to the table that may not be able to be possible if the proposed rule moves forward.
Absolutely. Can you give us some examples of tests that were either first offered as LDTs before there was any FDA cleared test available, or tests where there just never has been any FDA cleared or FDA approved test on the market?
I think that's been the history of modern diagnostics in a way. And I'm biased because I've worked my career in an academic medical center setting, and I've seen those innovations that happen in academic medical centers. And I know we'll talk more about this in a little bit, probably. But that innovation and that idea that a test could be valuable often comes from maybe a researcher at an academic medical center who knows as much about a disease as anybody else in the world, and they identify a novel biomarker, and they work with their colleagues to maybe build an assay, and then they clinically validate that assay to see how well it actually works. And they use that test once they've got clinical evidence of clinical validity that it actually works, and it works in a way for patients in that population that meets the patient's need. That's the history and evolution of lab testing. And maybe at some point, a diagnostic manufacturer comes in, they see an economic value to that, they see a clinical value to that, and they see a value to marketing and developing that across the country. And that's the natural progression. But that often starts in a hospital lab or a clinical laboratory, and often academic medical centers. I think that shouldn't get lost as part of this larger conversation about laboratory developed tests, because innovation is a really big part of it. If you can't innovate, then you can't move medicine forward. And I would say there's not a lot of innovation with some of the highly used conventional in vitro diagnostics that are used for routine practice. I mean, they're kind of locked down. And because of payer models, they're often reimbursed at very low rates. And there's no incentive for manufacturers to innovate for very routine tests. That innovation has come out of the laboratory-developed test space. And I don't want us to lose that. I think there's a balance. I think we can find the right regulatory framework. But I think what's proposed really does risk losing that innovation in the laboratory setting.
And with this innovation, what I'm hearing is these kinds of modifications can really make an LDT perform even better, perhaps, than what has been approved by the FDA as a test for a similar purpose. So are you aware of any tests that are LDTs that outperform in some manner a test that is FDA cleared?
We have quite a few LDTs that I would say fit that category, and that commonly fit that category in many different clinical laboratory settings. Mass spectrometry, it's a technology that's used to measure small molecules really precisely. It's used a lot for hormone testing. It's used for drug testing and therapeutic drug monitoring. It can measure drugs much more precisely and accurately and in much smaller concentrations than conventional FDA-cleared in vitro diagnostics, which are typically immunoassays. So we use many assays in mass spectrometry that outperform the FDA-cleared and approved alternatives. There's other examples. You brought this up in the last question as well, of tests that came out first as LDTs. When you think about some of the breast cancer markers that are currently used, I mean, those are LDTs. Many of them are LDT only. They just don't have FDA-cleared and approved alternatives. I think the market size also plays a role here, and hopefully I can explain this well. But if there's not a financial justification to develop a test and then bring it through FDA clearance and approval, like we talked about in the presentation with those user fees and costs, there's no way to get that to market under the proposed rule. The LDT avenue is cut off. And for rare disorders, particularly for things in pediatrics, we'll probably talk about this a little bit as well, I'm worried there will not be testing options available that will serve patients today and in the near future. I know that it sounds really bold to say that, but I genuinely worry about that as a physician.
It is. Well, I want to talk, John, a little bit about CLIA and CAP and where they come into play with this whole FDA proposed rule. And then we'll get into some of the pediatrics, immunohistochemistry, or other testing specialties. So does this proposed rule represent a situation where CLIA and CAP just disappear? How does this work with FDA and CLIA?
So no. The quick answer is no. CLIA does not go away. CAP does not go away. That's a separate conversation probably. But clinical laboratories are currently regulated under this federal law called the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments. That does not go away with the proposed rule. The proposed rule doesn't change that at all. Those rules and regulations still exist, and they're primarily around the operations of laboratory. They include performance standards that laboratories have to follow. But some of those performance standards actually specifically describe what you have to do with laboratory-developed tests. And that's part of the Code of Federal Regulations. It was also passed through notice and comment rulemaking. So there is a regulatory mechanism for laboratory-developed tests currently, but it's under CLIA. That would continue. The FDA is proposing an additional layer on top of that would primarily be focused in this manufacturing context, which really would involve test development, the packaging, the labeling of that, the information you could include on an interpretive report. They're really arguing that they should regulate that domain. So it's a regulatory layer on top of what CLIA already requires of clinical laboratories. Now, you mentioned CAP. There are CLIA-deemed accrediting agencies that have the ability to accredit labs per CLIA requirement so that you could be CAP accredited or New York State Department of Health accredited, and that also accredits you per CLIA. Those don't go away either. Now, those regulatory agencies may need to adapt or modify based on what new requirements are, and we don't know what those adaptations would be. We actually don't know what the final rule is, so you kind of can't even talk about how they would need to adapt before you saw what a final rule actually was. But yeah, you've brought up a really good point. There's a lot of agencies that already regulate clinical laboratories. I mean, I cringe when I hear that term wild, wild west, because it feels like the exact opposite of that. It is actually highly regulated. And I think the public deserve to know that. Their testing is being done appropriately in safe environments by clinical laboratorians who dedicate their lives to helping patients and to provide clinical care in a safe way. And the public needs reassurance of that as opposed to comments that maybe are suggesting otherwise, because that's not the reflection of our reality.
We got some questions, several questions, about immunohistochemistry.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that, how this proposed rule would affect that testing specialty?
That's a good one because the FDA has mentioned, I believe they specifically mentioned immunohistochemistry as an example of a pre-1976 method. And immunohistochemistry, for people who are watching, is a way to stain tissue so that you can look at that tissue and see whether there's cancer or other sorts of malignancies or other problems with that tissue. It's advanced dramatically since 1976. And I apologize if it's not specifically called out in the proposed rule. It may have been in prior communications as well. But it's advanced tremendously. I would say the proposed rule takes a position that manual testing is safer than automated testing. When I read the rule, that's kind of the lesson I'm getting from the FDA. And I don't subscribe to that opinion because I've seen a lot of automated testing. I've seen the accuracy, the precision that bringing automation into an assay can actually provide. It can make tests better, not worse. The reason I brought up automation in the context of immunohistochemistry is if you did that testing manually, maybe it would fall under this pre-1976 exempt status. But I think as most people who work in labs, particularly anatomic pathology labs, would know, that's being more and more automated to increase the efficiency, to decrease the costs. That automation under the proposed rule would likely place it under the oversight of the FDA as currently proposed. And so I don't think immunohistochemistry as a broad category you could say is totally exempt. I would think certainly once you automate it, it's not. There's also aspects to immunohistochemistry, how you stain, the number of stains you're using, the number of antibodies that you're using could also impact whether it's regulated or not. It gets to a bigger picture though. I don't think people have thought about how big of an impact this would have, not just on clinical pathology, the sort of testing of blood or serum or plasma, but also anatomic pathology, which is the testing of tissue that we typically use for cancer diagnosis. I think there is a very big impact on anatomic pathology, and if I was an anatomic pathologist, I would express my concerns or thoughts as part of the public comment period, because I think you may find that a significant portion of the testing that goes into creating the material that you use for interpretation would likely be regulated.
Along those same lines, pediatrics. Let's talk about LDTs in the pediatric context.
Yeah, I think that's a huge, important topic. Most FDA cleared and approved assays do not come with pediatric reference intervals. The vendors have not validated or tested those assays in pediatric populations, and you have to do that carefully, obviously, but it's expensive, and so they typically don't do it. And so many laboratories have to validate their own reference intervals or find reference intervals in the literature. And by reference interval, I mean finding the range of results that's essentially normal, so that when a physician gets that result, they know whether it's normal or abnormal for that patient, in this case, for that child. Pediatric patients, little humans, they're not just little adults. They have different laboratory test results depending on where they are in their stage of development and growth. And so many laboratories have to modify FDA cleared or approved tests to meet pediatric purposes. Maybe it's because of specimen tube sizes and shapes. Maybe it's to validate your own reference interval. Currently, most people wouldn't consider a reference interval validation to be a modified FDA cleared or approved assay that would be a laboratory developed test. But in this new FDA world, it might be if it's a change in intended use, because pediatrics are not listed in the package insert. There's many other tests that are pure LDTs that are used exclusively for pediatrics. A newborn screening to look for biochemical disorders that babies are born with. Almost all of that is laboratory developed test currently. And there's many other examples of things that are used in pediatrics that are because you get better sensitivity and specificity through mass spectrometry, for example, than you do for the FDA cleared and approved alternatives. So pediatrics, I would be very concerned about with the proposed rule because it has big implications for what testing you could do on a pediatric specimen and maybe the cost of compliance just for pediatric purposes.
Let's move to pharmacogenetics. We got several questions about PGX testing and also about the clinical interpretation aspect of PGX. Do you want to mention a few things about LDTs in that area?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad people submitted questions on this too. PGX stands for pharmacogenetics. It's a type of testing you do that looks for a genetic basis for different metabolisms, sometimes related to how your body metabolizes different drugs. It's really important testing, and in prior years, the FDA provided comments on what they thought was or was not appropriate for pharmacogenetic testing. I won't go into the depth of those comments in what was previously discussed, but I think it brings up a really important issue related to the interpretation of test results. As a clinical pathologist, I think I have the right and responsibility to customize interpretive results to meet the needs of our patients and our patient populations. And that's critically important for pharmacogenetics because some of these alleles or differences in genetic code across populations can actually have significant impacts on how they metabolize drugs. And I could see the need for a particular laboratory to customize what they're writing to meet their patient population and the demographics that they have. If you lock that down, you can't really do that. And I think that would be a disservice to patients. So I expect a lot of comments, public comments, to focus on pharmacogenetics specifically, given how rapidly evolving that's been, but also its clinical use and how this could be an issue under the current proposed rule.
One more specialty that we got several questions about is toxicology. Let's talk about that and how LDTs are playing a role in toxicology and how the proposed rule would affect that. And then we'll move on to a different topic.
Now, I'm glad you brought up toxicology as well. Most people do not recognize that the confirmatory tests for drug of abuse screening, almost all of them are laboratory developed tests. The FDA cleared and approved tests are often immunoassays. They use antibodies to detect drugs. They're great screening tests, but they typically have a certain degree of false positive or false negative results based on how the tests were designed and how they perform. We therefore use more sensitive technologies like mass spectrometry and toxicology in particular to confirm that positive screen result and to confirm whether that drug is truly there. That's currently being done by laboratory developed tests. So I think that can't be lost. I'd also place that into context. We are in the midst of this opioid epidemic throughout the country, and we rely on laboratory developed tests to confirm the presence of drugs of abuse. But it's not just drugs that shouldn't be there. We also use laboratory developed tests for therapeutic drug monitoring and monitoring of drugs to make sure that they stay in the appropriate therapeutic range for a variety of different conditions or disorders. So LDTs are used widely in toxicology, and the proposed rule would certainly have an impact in that domain as well.
Okay, we're moving on to a different topic. This is a very interesting one that's a little bit unique to ARUP. So in the proposed rule, the FDA asks specifically for comments about potential exemptions for academic medical centers, or AMCs. And even in the proposed rule, they offer some kind of potential definition for AMCs. What are your thoughts on that?
I think with the VALID Act and the discussion in Congress, there was a lot of discussion and pressure on whether academic medical centers should have an exemption from the VALID Act. And the FDA in their proposed rule has asked for feedback on what the role of academic medical centers should be and whether an exemption should exist here as well. I would acknowledge academic medical centers have a certain degree of diversity and may be hard to create a unified definition. I think there are some flaws in the definition that the FDA has proposed. We're commenting on this in our own public comment letter as well. The FDA believes that all testing needs to be done at the same physical address as the academic medical center to be considered an AMC laboratory. That's actually not the way most AMCs are organized that have consolidated into core labs that do a certain degree of testing, and then they've got offsite facilities for clinical care. They're networks, really. So I think the same physical address caveat is probably a limitation that shouldn't exist there as well. AMCs are unique. We talked about innovation. They also have training programs. This is where physicians and other medical professionals learn about diagnostics. It's where they learn about effective test utilization. It's a really unique setting where you're often close to the patient. But I would say with telemedicine, that physical proximity to a patient is something that probably shouldn't be in an AMC definition as well, because there are many academic medical centers that do predominance of clinical care, at least a lot of it, through telemedicine, certainly since the pandemic. We're unique at ARUP, right? We're an academic medical center and a reference lab and a hospital lab and clinical labs all kind of combined into one unique entity. I still identify as an academic medical center. The last thing I would say is, in the advanced definition, at least the one that they've thrown out there, probably most academic medical centers, because of that physical location restriction, probably wouldn't qualify. So we've shared, I think, a smaller definition that maybe would fit if there is the idea of an exemption, but that's certainly going to be a topic of a lot of the public comments. And there's strong opinions on both sides of the argument. Again, though, I think AMCs are a pretty unique setting, and the FDA would have a benefit if they better understood what was happening in AMCs.
Let's go to impact on our test menu at ARUP. So this represents a dramatic change in the oversight of laboratory-developed tests. What do you anticipate the impact to what we can offer at ARUP would be?
That's a really important question. It's one we've talked about a lot. I have to preface it with something, though. You can't know until the rule is finalized. And so I think we need to be a little bit guarded on how we talk about it because we don't know what's in the proposed rule. If there are things like grandfathering included in the proposed rule where a test could stay on the market if it was introduced prior to the finalization of the rule, that would have a dramatic impact on clinical laboratories, at least in the short term, to be able to continue offering care. If there isn't something like that, this will have a pretty big impact on a lot of laboratories. I'm worried mostly about hospital labs and smaller community clinical laboratories that probably rely on modified tests for a lot of testing that they do for things like body fluids. ARUP is a complex operation. We have a lot of laboratory-developed tests, but we have a lot of expertise to support those. I am concerned about the cost of compliance, like I brought up in the presentation and here several times, that we're not immune to that. We're in the same boat as other hospitals and clinical laboratories as well, but we do have a more extensive menu about laboratory-developed tests. So it's something we're working on. We're currently in the process of just mapping out how LDTs might fit device categories. But even that being said, the FDA hasn't fully described how those class 1, 2, 3 categories would actually match to clinical laboratory assays currently being offered. So it's not possible to even finalize that list, but we're actively working on it.
Let's talk about what happens after December 4th.
Yeah.
So I think many of us were surprised to see FDA deny extension requests to the comment deadline. So comments are due by December 4th. So December 5th, and then thereafter, what happens then? Talk us through kind of the timeline of what we should be doing, what hospital labs should be doing, and then what we might see in the coming months from FDA.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up as well. The FDA still has time to grant an extension. Now, they've said publicly that they will not do that, but I would say they still have time to think about the benefits of granting an extension to the public comment period. I believe there are many settings that are still trying to interpret what the rule would mean to them. And if you haven't developed that response, it's really hard to provide in the public comment period a fully informed response that you can give back to the FDA. So I personally hope they grant an extension as well. What happens if there's not an extension, or even if there is? At some point, the rule will be finalized. There's actually not much anybody can do to stop the FDA from finalizing this rule outside of the head of the FDA, Health and Human Services, or the president themselves. That's the three people that could stop this. The next step is to finalize the rule. So as part of the notice and comment rulemaking process, the FDA has to take all the comments they receive from the public and then respond to them. They don't have to respond to everyone individually, but they do have to respond in categories that will reflect the types of comments that they got. That legitimately will take a while to do. Chances are they've already started on some of the ones that they know that they're going to get. But there's probably comments that they haven't anticipated. It's likely this will take several months. People are generally saying probably April-ish, maybe when we see a final rule. Other people have said maybe June. It depends on how long it takes to actually respond. After the rule is finalized, it is quite possible, if not likely, that there will be organizations that may disagree with the FDA's claim that it has the legal authority to do this. So there will quite possibly or likely be lawsuits against the FDA to challenge this administrative ruling. That whole process would take its own span of time. The reason I bring that up, though, is to just for people to be familiar with this other term, preliminary injunction. And I know you're a lawyer as well as our compliance officer. There is a question on whether a court, if this was brought to court, would grant a preliminary injunction, or basically a stay that would say, do not advance the rule until we've had a chance to make a judicial ruling on whether this is or is not appropriate. It's unclear whether that would or wouldn't happen. It depends on the court. It depends on who would take this to court as well. But I say all of that to say the rule is currently not finalized. Even once it is finalized, there's probably a legal process that will happen afterwards. But it would get very confusing for the clinical lab community if it was finalized. The rule was allowed to move forward while a court was looking at it, and you'd have to decide, do you comply, do you not comply? And that would put clinical laboratories in a very precarious and expensive situation. So I would certainly hope that these major issues are resolved prior to any rule being finalized, because it could be damaging to the clinical lab community and the patients that we serve.
Where do you foresee the majority of the expense falling within the various stages or years after the rule becomes final, if it ever does? There's various phases and stages that you talked about. Yeah. Where is the majority of the burden?
The majority of the burden is in stage 4 and 5. Those are the submissions and the reviews for 510K and pre-market authorizations. The user fees are probably the largest easy to quantify cost, but I would say there's other costs that are not easy to quantify. The compliance costs involved with making sure your paperwork fits the format that the FDA currently requires under manufacturer quality system requirements as opposed to CLIA quality system requirements. I think they've dramatically underestimated the cost, time, and expertise it would take to sort of reformat. There may even be experiments that need to be done if the FDA believes that prior experiments under CLIA don't match what the FDA would require as well. I think there are extremely significant compliance costs in that phase 2, and that's not really factored in to the proposed rule.
Well, John, this has been fantastic. I think we've covered the majority of the questions that were submitted to us. I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us and with our viewers.
No, thanks for doing this as well. And I would say to anybody who's listening, if you have other questions, feel free and send them to me. I'm happy to chat about laboratory tests, developed tests. I'm happy to chat about our perspective, both as a reference laboratory, but also a hospital laboratory at an academic medical center. I think it's really important that we share our comments. And for anybody listening, please consider submitting a public comment. Maybe a few things that I shared as part of that presentation on best practices are things you want to think about before you submit it, just to make sure that you're doing something appropriate and that you're following your own institutional guidelines. But the purpose of a public comment period is to hear from the public. And as I said in the presentation, you are the experts. Please let your opinion be known because now is the time to do it. What is part of the administrative record is what is submitted as public comments, and that is all that will be reviewed if this goes to a judicial review later. So the public comment period is incredibly important. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining as well. I think this has been a wonderful opportunity to share our perspective. I know there are other perspectives as well. That's part of the public comment period. And one final note, for additional information on laboratory developed tests, feel free and visit our website. We've included a link here on this slide. It also includes a direct link to the public comment portal as well, to the FDA and the Federal Register. Thank you.